Alright, so I never thought I'd be one of those people posting on here. But I guess life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 8 years now. For the most part, I thought we had a solid relationship. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I always believed we could work through anything. At least, that's what I told myself that we met in college. She was that kind of girl who could walk into a room and turn heads without even trying. Charming, funny, and sharp as a whip. I fell for her hard. Back then, I'd never have guessed that one day I'd be sitting here questioning everything. We got married 2 years after graduation, settled into a nice little house in the suburbs, and life was good, or so I thought. Things started to change about 6 months ago. At first, it was subtle. Emily became more distant, like her mind was somewhere else even when she was sitting right next to me. Little things started adding up: late nights at work, her phone glued to her hand, and that faint smile she'd get when she thought no one was watching. I chalked it up to stress at first. She'd recently started a new job, so I figured the pressure was getting to her. But something didn't sit right with me. Then came the neighbor. His name is Daniel, and he moved into the house next door about 7 months ago. Single guy, early 30s, good-looking in that annoyingly effortless way. He introduced himself the day he moved in friendly enough, but there was something about the way he looked at Emily that made my stomach twist. I brushed it off as paranoia. I mean, come on, who gets jealous of a neighbor, right? But looking back, I should have trusted my gut.at first. Emily barely acknowledged Daniel. Or maybe she was just good at hiding it. But soon enough, I started noticing little things: the way her eyes would light up when she spotted him outside, the extra time she'd spend on her appearance before stepping into the yard. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. After all, Emily and I had been through so much together. I couldn't imagine her throwing it all away, but the signs kept piling up. Her phone, once an open book, now had a password. She started going out more often: book club meetings, girls' nights, yoga classes that always seemed to run late. I tried to talk to her about it a few times, but she'd just laugh it off or get defensive. Said I was imagining things, that I needed to trust her. So I did. Or at least, I tried that. I guess the real turning point came one Saturday afternoon. I was out mowing the lawn when I noticed Emily and Daniel talking over the fence. It wasn't anything overt, just a friendly chat. But the way she laughed at something he said, tilting her head back with that smile I hadn't seen in months, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I killed the mower and walked over, casually joining the conversation. Emily stiffened the moment she saw me, her smile vanishing like smoke. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't miss a beat: cool, confident, like he had nothing to hide. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But every time I tried to bring it up, Emily would flip the script, accusing me of being jealous, controlling, paranoid. And maybe she had a point. Maybe I was imagining things. At least, that's what I told myself, but deep down, I knew that I just didn't have the proof. Not yet. Alright, so after that Saturday afternoon, things started to shift. It was like a crack had formed in the foundation of my marriage, and no matter how much I tried to patch it up, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I found myself noticing everything: every glance, every smile, every time Emily's phone buzzed and she quickly turned it face down. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. But then again, maybe I wasn't. About a week after that awkward encounter by the fence, I decided to test the waters. I casually mentioned Daniel during dinner, nothing accusatory, just a simple, "So, have you talked to Daniel lately?" Emily barely looked up from her plate. "Not really," she said, too quickly. Her fork scraped against the plate as she pushed her food around. "Why?" "No reason," I replied, watching her closely. Her shoulders tensed just slightly, a movement so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. After 8 years of marriage, I knew her tells. The way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous. The way she'd avoid eye contact when she wasn't being entirely honest. Still, I let it slide. I needed more than gut feelings. I needed proof. That proof came sooner than I expected. It happened on a Tuesday night. Emily had told me she was meeting her friends for dinner, something she'd been doing more and more lately. Normally, I'd stay home and try to distract myself with work or TV, but that night, something in me wouldn't settle. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from one of her friends. It was just a simple message: "Hey, tell Emily we missed her tonight. Hope everything's okay." My heart dropped. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. She wasn't with her friends. So where was she? I sat there for a moment, phone clutched tightly in my hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I had no clear plan, just a gnawing suspicion that wouldn't let me sit still. I drove through the neighborhood, eyes scanning every car that passed by. I told myself I was being crazy. But then, as I turned onto the street leading to the next block, I saw it. Daniel's house, and parked right in front of it was Emily's car. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more painful than the last. Maybe she was just visiting. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, my heart hammering in my chest. The street was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I approached the house slowly, each step heavier than the last. The windows were dark, curtains drawn, but a faint glow seeped through the gaps. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Then I heard it, laughter, her laughter. It was muffled, but unmistakable. The sound sliced through me, sharp and cold as a blade. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of nausea rolled through me. I stepped closer, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel path leading to the side of the house. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, to walk away before I saw something I couldn't unsee. But my feet kept moving, reaching the side window. I hesitated. My pulse pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I didn't want to look. But I had to know. I peered through the narrow gap in the curtains. Inside, Daniel stood near the kitchen island, leaning casually against the counter with that same confident smirk I'd come to despise. And there, standing far too close to him, was Emily. She had that same smile, the one she used to save for me, the one that used to light up my world. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said, her eyes sparkling with a warmth I hadn't seen in months. My stomach twisted into knots as a rush of heat flooded my chest, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and betrayal so intense it stole the breath from my lungs. I wanted to burst through that door, to confront them both right then and there. But my feet felt rooted to the ground. My mind spun with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. How long had this been going on? Had it started before Daniel moved in, or had their connection sparked the moment he arrived? And why would she do this to me, to us? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the scene unfold like some twisted nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every laugh, every glance, every touch carved deeper into my chest until I couldn't take it anymore. My vision blurred with unshed tears as I stumbled back, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break free from my chest. Without thinking, I turned and walked back to my car, my legs moving on autopilot. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of emotions. I needed to get out of there before I did something I'd regret. The drive home was a blur. I barely remember pulling into the driveway, barely remember stepping inside the house that no longer felt like home. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. Hours later, long after midnight, Emily returned home. I heard the click of the front door, the soft rustle of her coat as she hung it up. My pulse spiked as her footsteps approached the bedroom, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. The door creaked open, and I could feel her eyes on me as I lay there, feigning sleep. She stood there for a moment, silent, as if debating whether to say something. But then she turned and slipped into bed beside me, her movements careful and deliberate. I kept my breathing slow and steady, my mind racing as I tried to decide what to do next, because now I knew the truth, and there was no going back. That I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling while the weight of what I had seen pressed down on my chest like a stone. Her breathing was slow and steady beside me, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't been standing in another man's kitchen with that smile that used to belong to me. The air felt thick and suffocating, every breath a struggle against the storm of emotions tearing through my mind. Anger, disbelief, heartbreak, each one crashed against the next in an endless loop that wouldn't let me rest. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, my decision was made. I couldn't live with the knowledge of her betrayal festering inside me. I had to confront her, to tear away the facade and force her to face what she had done. My heart pounded as I got out of bed, every step toward the kitchen heavy with anticipation of the moment to come. She appeared a few minutes later, her eyes bleary with sleep as she poured herself a cup of coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of my calm facade. I waited until she sat down at the table before I faced her, my pulse hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst free. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. I simply laid the truth bare in stark, unflinching terms, describing everything I had seen the night before with a cold precision that left no room for denial. The impact was immediate. Her face drained of color, her eyes widening as if she had been struck. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, caught between shock and something else, something darker that flickered just beneath the surface. Then, like a switch flipping, her expression shifted. The initial flash of guilt vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by something harder, colder, as if the mask she had worn for so long had cracked, revealing the person beneath. She leaned back in her chair, her posture shifting from shock to defense as her gaze met mine with a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. Her eyes were hard and calculating, her expression carefully controlled as if weighing her next move. The silence between us stretched out, heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of everything that had led us to this moment. Then, without a hint of remorse, she began to deny everything. Her voice was steady, her tone measured as she dismissed my accusations as jealousy and paranoia, twisting my words until they no longer resembled the truth. Each denial was like a slap to the face, sharp and deliberate, designed to make me question my own reality. But I stood my ground, refusing to be swayed by her carefully crafted lies. I described the scene I had witnessed in vivid detail, each word stripping away her defenses until the cracks began to show. Her composure wavered, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to anger as she realized she could no longer manipulate her way out of the truth. Yet even as her denials faltered, she clung to her narrative with a stubbornness born of desperation, each lie more brazen than the last as she fought to maintain control of the situation. The air between us grew thick with tension, every breath a struggle against the storm of emotions threatening to consume us both. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched her twist and contort the truth, each word driving a wedge deeper between us until the distance between who we had been and who we had become seemed insurmountable. And still, she lied. Even as the evidence stood clear and undeniable, she clung to her falsehoods with a determination that bordered on defiance, as if admitting the truth would shatter the carefully constructed world she had built around herself. The woman sitting across from me was no longer the woman I had married. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and laughter, now held a cold, calculating glint that sent a chill down my spine. Yet beneath the surface, I could see the cracks beginning to form, the faint tremor in her hands, the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking. For all her lies and manipulations, she could not erase the truth etched into every moment of that night, nor could she undo the damage her betrayal had wrought upon the foundation of our marriage. The confrontation stretched on, each word a blow that chipped away at the facade we had both clung to for so long until there was nothing left but the raw, unvarnished reality of what she had done. And yet, even as the walls came crashing down around us, she refused to take responsibility for her actions. Instead, she shifted the blame onto me, accusing me of driving her away with my jealousy and mistrust, as if her betrayal were somehow my fault. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, each one calculated to wound, to tear down the last shreds of self-worth I had left. But even as the accusations rained down upon me, I held firm, refusing to be drawn into her web of lies and manipulation. I had seen the truth with my own eyes, and no amount of denial or deflection could erase the image burned into my memory. By the time the confrontation finally ended, the air between us felt thick with the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid. The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm of broken trust and shattered illusions that neither of us could cross. As she rose from the table and walked away without another word, I was left standing in the wreckage of the life we had built together, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Yet even as the echoes of our confrontation faded into the stillness of the house, one thought remained clear in my mind: this was only the beginning. The hours after the confrontation passed in a haze. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each moment dragging by with a heaviness that settled deep in my bones. Emily moved through the house like a ghost, her presence lingering in every room, every shadow, every breath of air. The space between us felt vast and unbridgeable, a chasm carved by lies and betrayals that could never be undone. Yet somehow, we continued to exist beneath the same roof, two strangers trapped in the shell of a life that no longer belonged to either of us. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, the images from that night replayed in an endless loop: the warmth in her eyes as she stood beside Daniel, the laughter that had once belonged to me now shared with someone else. The sound echoed in my mind, a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. My thoughts twisted and tangled into knots of doubt and anger, questions with no answers swirling endlessly through my mind. How long had it been going on? How many lies had she told to cover her tracks? Had I ever truly known the woman I had married, or had the version of her I loved been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next in a blur of strained silences and hollow routines. Emily carried on as if nothing had happened, her mask of normalcy firmly in place. She smiled when she spoke, her laughter light and easy, as if the weight of her choices had never touched her. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Her eyes flicked toward me with quick, assessing glances when she thought I wasn't looking, searching for some sign of what I might do next. Her movements were sharp and deliberate, her posture tense as if bracing for a blow that had yet to fall. Still, she never acknowledged the truth that hung between us like a blade suspended by a thread, ready to fall at any moment. That I found myself watching her more closely than ever before, studying every glance, every gesture, every shift in her tone. Patterns began to emerge: subtle shifts in her schedule, the way her phone seemed to buzz more frequently late at night, the way her eyes flicked toward the window whenever she passed by, as if searching for something beyond the glass. Each small detail, insignificant on its own, became another piece of the puzzle, painting a picture I could no longer ignore. It wasn't over, despite everything that had been said, despite the confrontation that had torn open the heart of our marriage. She hadn't stopped. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and leaving me hollow and aching. I had clung to the hope that the truth would be enough to shatter whatever hold Daniel had over her, that the weight of what she had done would force her to see the damage she had caused. But hope, I realized, was a fool's refuge. The truth was far more brutal. She had made her choice, and it hadn't been me. The need for proof burned beneath my skin like a fever, driving me to search for answers that I both needed and dreaded. I began to pay closer attention to the details I had once overlooked: the timestamps on her text messages, the unexplained gaps in her schedule, the faint traces of cologne that clung to her clothes when she returned home late at night. Each clue was a thread leading deeper into the labyrinth of her deception, pulling me toward a truth I could no longer deny. It was on a rainy Thursday evening that the final piece fell into place. I had returned home earlier than expected, the steady patter of rain against the windows filling the air with a soft, rhythmic cadence. The house was silent, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. Emily's car was gone. I stood in the doorway, the damp chill of the rain clinging to my skin as I scanned the empty rooms, my heart hammering against my ribs. I should have known better than to hope she had simply gone to the store or run an errand. The truth, I knew, would be far less innocent. Driven by a need I could no longer suppress, I stepped back into the rain and climbed into my car, the engine roaring to life as I pulled away from the house. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I drove through the darkened streets, my pulse a steady drumbeat against my temples. The route was familiar now, etched into my mind by countless sleepless nights spent tracing the path between our home and Daniel's. Yet as I approached his house, a sense of dread settled heavy in my chest, each breath a struggle against the weight of what I might find. Pulling to a stop a short distance away, I killed the engine and sat in the darkness, rain drumming against the windshield in a steady cadence. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and unwelcoming, curtains drawn tight against the night. Yet as I watched, a faint flicker of light caught my eye, a brief glimpse of movement beyond the glass, a shadow shifting against the glow of a lamp. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking across my skin as I strained to see through the rain-streaked glass. Minutes passed in tense silence, each heartbeat a countdown to something inevitable. Then, just as I began to question my own sanity, the front door opened. Emily stepped into the rain, her coat pulled tight against the chill, her face turned slightly away as if to shield herself from the downpour. Daniel followed a moment later, his silhouette framed briefly in the doorway before he stepped back inside, leaving her standing alone beneath the porch light. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the street as if sensing unseen eyes watching from the darkness. Then she turned and walked quickly toward her car, her footsteps splashing against the wet pavement as she disappeared into the night. That I sat frozen, the air thick with the weight of what I had just witnessed. There was no longer any room for doubt, no more questions left unanswered. The truth lay bare before me, stark and undeniable, carved into the fabric of my reality with a finality that left no room for escape. Yet even as the weight of her betrayal settled heavy upon my chest, another thought began to take root, a realization that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days after that night blurred into a haze of numbness and raw-edged awareness. Every sound in the house seemed louder, every movement sharper, as if the air itself had grown tense with the weight of unspoken truths. Emily moved through the rooms with practiced ease, her smile polished and her laughter light, as though nothing had changed. But beneath that facade, I could see the cracks, brief flickers of tension in her shoulders, the quick glances she stole when she thought I wasn't looking. Each moment seemed poised on the brink of something inevitable, a slow-motion fall toward an end neither of us dared to name. The silence between us stretched thin, taut as a wire pulled to the breaking point. Words no longer held meaning. Each glance, each gesture, carried the weight of everything left unsaid, the accusations that burned on the edge of my tongue, the lies she wove with every breath. Nights passed in restless solitude, the air between us thick with unspoken truths as we lay side by side in a bed that no longer felt like home. Sleep became a battleground, my mind caught in an endless loop of images and questions with no answers. Emily's absences grew more frequent. Excuses came easily, a late meeting at work, drinks with friends, errands that stretched long into the evening. Each time she left, I felt the air grow heavier, the walls of the house pressing closer as if bearing witness to the unraveling of everything we had built. Yet no matter how much I wanted to confront her again, something held me back, a hesitation born of exhaustion, of the knowledge that words would change nothing. The truth had already taken root, and no amount of denial could erase what I had seen. I began to watch more closely, my gaze tracing the patterns of her days with a quiet intensity that bordered on obsession. Each glance at her phone, each pause at the window, became another thread woven into the tapestry of her deception. Yet even as the evidence piled higher, a part of me clung to the hope that I was wrong, that somewhere beneath the lies and betrayals, the woman I had loved still existed. But hope, I had learned, was a fragile thing. easily shattered by the weight of reality. It was a Wednesday evening when the last threads of that hope unraveled. Rain lashed against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder echoing through the air as storm clouds gathered overhead. Emily had left hours ago, her departure marked by the faint click of the front door and the distant hum of her car fading into the night. I sat alone in the living room, the steady patter of rain against the glass the only sound breaking the silence. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of anticipation, as if the night itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. Minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock a reminder of her absence. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer with every breath. My mind circled endlessly around the same questions, each thought leading back to the image of her standing beside Daniel beneath the porch light, her gaze flicking toward the street as if searching for unseen eyes. The memory burned behind my eyes, vivid and unrelenting, until I could no longer sit still beneath the weight of it. Driven by a need I could no longer deny, I rose from the chair and stepped into the rain, the cold sting of water against my skin sharpening my focus as I climbed into my car. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I pulled away from the house and into the storm. The street stretched out before me, slick with rain and glistening beneath the glow of streetlights, each turn bringing me closer to the truth I both sought and feared. As I approached Daniel's house, the air seemed to grow heavier, the distant rumble of thunder a low, steady pulse beneath the steady patter of rain. I slowed the car to a crawl, headlights cutting through the darkness as the familiar silhouette of Daniel's house loomed ahead. The windows glowed softly with the warm light of lamps, casting faint shadows against the drawn curtains. Yet no movement stirred within, no flicker of figures passing behind the glass. That I waited, minutes dragged by intense silence, my pulse hammering against my ribs with each beat. The air inside the car felt stifling, the steady drumming of rain against the roof a relentless reminder of the passage of time. Yet still, I waited, my gaze fixed on the darkened windows as if sheer will alone could tear aside the curtains and reveal the truth hidden within. Then, without warning, the front door opened. Emily stepped into the rain, her coat pulled tight against the chill, her face pale and drawn beneath the dim glow of the porch light. Her gaze flicked toward the street as if sensing unseen eyes, the faint furrow of her brow betraying a flicker of unease. For a moment, she stood frozen, her breath rising in faint plumes of mist against the cold night air. Then, with a quick glance back toward the house, she hurried down the steps and into the waiting car parked at the curb, a sleek black sedan whose engine purred to life the moment she climbed inside. The car pulled away from the curb, its taillights vanishing into the rain-soaked night. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched it disappear, a surge of cold adrenaline flooding my veins as realization struck with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't leaving Daniel's house to return home. She was going somewhere else. Without hesitation, I threw the car into gear and pulled away from the curb, tires splashing through puddles as I followed the distant glow of taillights disappearing into the rain. The street stretched out before me in a blur of wet pavement and flickering streetlights, each turn leading me deeper into the unknown. The steady hum of the engine filled the air, a low, steady pulse that seemed to echo the rhythm of my racing heart. Minutes passed in tense silence, the distance between us shrinking with each turn until the faint glow of taillights appeared once more, flickering through the rain like a distant beacon. I kept my distance, careful to remain unseen as the sedan wove through the darkened streets, its path winding steadily away from the familiar neighborhoods of home and into unfamiliar territory. The buildings grew taller, the streets narrower, until the glow of distant city lights shimmered against the rain-slick pavement. The car slowed as it approached a narrow alleyway, its tires splashing through shallow puddles as it disappeared into the shadows beyond. I followed at a distance, my hands clenched tight around the wheel as I turned onto the narrow street and brought the car to a halt beneath the shelter of an overhanging awning. Rain drummed against the roof in a steady cadence, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and distant exhaust. Stepping into the rain, I moved toward the alley's mouth, each step measured and deliberate as I pressed myself against the rough brick wall and peered into the shadows beyond. Dim light flickered from a doorway halfway down the narrow corridor, casting faint silhouettes against the rain-soaked pavement. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I strained to see through the gloom, each breath a struggle against the knot tightening in my chest, and then I saw her. Emily stood beneath the flickering light, her gaze fixed on the figure before her, a man whose face remained obscured by the shadows cast by the doorway. Their proximity was unmistakable, the faint brush of hands, the low murmur of voices too distant to hear. My breath caught in my throat as the realization settled cold and heavy in my chest, each heartbeat a dull, echoing thud against the silence of the alley. This wasn't about Daniel anymore. The betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined, and I was only beginning to see just how far the web of lies truly extended. The rain clung to my skin, soaking through my clothes as I stood frozen at the mouth of the alley, the distant hum of city life fading into a low murmur against the pounding of my heart. Each breath came shallow and sharp, the cold air biting against my lungs as I watched the scene unfold before me. Emily's figure stood outlined against the dim light, her posture tense yet deliberate as she leaned toward the shadowed figure before her. The faint brush of hands, the tilt of her head, the soft curve of her smile, it was all there, laid bare beneath the flickering street lamp. I strained to see the man's face, but the shadows clung to him like a cloak, obscuring every feature save the faint glint of his eyes as they flicked toward the mouth of the alley. My pulse spiked, breath hitching in my throat as I pressed myself tighter against the rough brick wall, the damp chill seeping into my bones. Yet still, I couldn't tear my gaze away. The air seemed thick with unspoken tension, the faint murmur of their voices carried away by the steady patter of rain against the pavement. Seconds stretched into minutes, each heartbeat a countdown to something inevitable. My mind churned with questions that offered no answers. Who was this man? How long had it been going on? And why, after everything that had already happened, did she continue down this path as if the destruction of our marriage wasn't enough? The weight of it pressed down on my chest, suffocating in its finality, yet still, I stood rooted in place, unable to move as the scene played out before me like the final act of a tragedy from which there could be no escape. Then, without warning, the man stepped back, his figure melting into the shadows as if the night itself had swallowed him whole. Emily hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the space he had occupied as though reluctant to part ways. Then, with a faint shiver that seemed to ripple through her entire frame, she turned and walked briskly toward the mouth of the alley, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement with each step. Panic surged through me, a rush of adrenaline so intense it sent a tremor through my limbs. My mind screamed at me to move, to vanish into the night before she spotted me, yet my feet remained rooted to the ground as if held fast by the weight of what I had witnessed. Each step drew her closer, her figure growing sharper beneath the dim glow of the streetlights until I could make out the faint furrow of her brow, the tension that clung to her shoulders like an invisible shroud. At the last moment, I stumbled back into the shadows, heart hammering against my ribs as she stepped past the mouth of the alley and onto the sidewalk beyond. I watched as she paused beneath the faint glow of a street lamp, her gaze flicking toward the distant hum of traffic before she pulled her coat tighter against the rain and vanished into the night. Silence settled heavy in her wake, broken only by the steady patter of rain against the pavement and the distant murmur of city life beyond the alley's narrow walls. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the weight of everything I had seen, everything I could no longer deny. The threads of her betrayal had woven themselves deep into the fabric of my reality, each lie another strand binding me to a truth I could neither escape nor ignore. But even as the finality of it settled heavy in my chest, another thought began to take root, a cold, sharp realization that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about Emily and Daniel. There was more to this than I had ever imagined, a deeper current of deception that stretched beyond the walls of our home and into the shadows of a world I had never known. And I was no longer content to stand on the sidelines, watching my life unravel one thread at a time. The drive home passed in a blur, the distant glow of headlights smearing against the rain-slick windshield as I navigated the empty streets in silence. Each turn brought me closer to the house that no longer felt like home, the weight of the night pressing heavier against my chest with each passing mile. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands trembled against the steering wheel, adrenaline still coursing hot and fast through my veins as the echoes of what I had witnessed played on an endless loop behind my eyes. Inside, the house lay silent and still, the air thick with the weight of absence. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet and the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen beyond. Yet even in the stillness, I could feel the echo of her presence lingering in the air, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to the walls, the distant trace of her laughter woven into the silence like a memory just out of reach. Hours later, the faint click of the front door announced her return, the soft rustle of fabric and the muted clink of keys against the table punctuating the silence as she moved through the house with the practiced ease of someone who had long since learned to navigate the shadows of their own deception. I lay motionless in the darkness, breath slow and steady as if sleep had claimed me, though my mind remained sharp and clear, every nerve on edge as I listened to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She paused outside the bedroom door, her presence a weight against the air as if she could feel the tension woven into the very walls of the room. For a moment, I thought she might speak, that she might finally break the silence that had grown so thick between us that it threatened to suffocate us both. But no words came. Instead, she stepped lightly across the threshold, the faint shift of air brushing against my skin as she moved toward the dresser and began to undress in silence. Each sound etched itself into my memory: the soft rustle of fabric, the faint clink of jewelry against the wooden surface, the slow, deliberate creak of the drawer sliding shut. Her movements were careful and precise, each gesture calculated to leave no trace of the night that had passed. Yet even as she moved with the practiced ease of someone well versed in the art of deception, I could hear the faint tremor in her breath, the subtle hitch that betrayed the weight of whatever emotions she carried beneath the mask she wore so effortlessly. Long after she slipped beneath the covers, I lay motionless beside her, eyes open and unseeing as the darkness pressed close against my skin. The air between us felt thick with unspoken truths, each breath a reminder of the distance that stretched wider with every passing day. Yet even as the weight of betrayal settled heavy in my chest, a new resolve began to take shape, a cold, sharp determination that burned like ice beneath my skin. This wasn't over, not until I knew the full truth, not until I uncovered every lie she had ever told, and not until I decided what to do with the pieces that remained. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness that clung to the air like a final breath before a storm. Emily moved through the house with her usual grace, her eyes avoiding mine as if she could sense the weight of the truth pressing between us. Each glance, each step, carried the echo of everything that had passed, yet she wore her mask with practiced ease, as though the cracks beneath the surface no longer mattered. But I saw them. I saw the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking. The walls she had built around herself had begun to crumble, and beneath them lay the remnants of a life we could never rebuild. I had followed the threads of her betrayal to their inevitable end, each lie leading me deeper into the shadows of a world I could no longer ignore. Now, there was nothing left to discover. No more questions to ask. No more answers to find. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the walls, I stood in the doorway and watched her move through the house one last time. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, the silence a chasm neither of us could cross. Yet even as the weight of everything we had lost pressed heavy against my chest, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a clarity born from the ashes of what had been. There would be no more confrontations. No more accusations. No more waiting for answers that would never come. As I stepped through the door and into the night, the air seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of her lies had finally fallen away. The path before me stretched wide and clear, unburdened by the shadows of the past. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: that I would never look back.